So thank you so much, Stefan, for those kind remarks. And seriously, if you want, there's so many empty seats down here in the front. So the subject of my address this afternoon is entitled The New Imperatives of Educational Change Towards Achievement with Integrity, and it really meshes beautifully with the remarks of the previous speakers, which I have to say, and this is not just flattery, this is the best introduction to a conference I have ever heard in my whole life. In my whole life. To understand that every school leader has to have a philosophy of education. And if you don't have an explicit one, you will have an implicit one. So you might as well know what it is explicitly, okay, not just tacitly. To understand that there is a certain hermeneutics or interpretation of education that we're always bringing to the process. This beautiful expression of we have to learn many different languages, as many as we can, and understand and be able to feel the culture that stands behind that language. This contribution to world peace, which we need so much right now, and I'm very aware of, coming from my own context. These are really important foundational knowledge to have for educational improvement in the future. So there's things that we have to do. There's things that we must do if we are to help humanity to realize its full potential and to navigate through the perilous times that we're facing today. My remarks today will be based on two books. I like this very much, this idea of slowing down or maybe even stopping, because I think this is a very deep insight. Sometimes we do school reform very badly. And I was working with teachers in Boston, starting back in 2005, who were ready to get out of the profession. So this theme of burnout is a major theme for us, and it's an international theme. And we decided just to get together on Saturday mornings and to debrief what was going on and to support each other. And out of that project came a book entitled The Mindful Teacher, which may be the book that I'm actually the proudest of, because it's written with a classroom teacher, and it's responding to the everyday issues that teachers face, okay? Rebellious students, angry parents, a rigid bureaucracy, and lots of pressure and accountability in a time of unprecedented technological change. So in that book, we tried to say together, as colleagues working together across the profession, we said, how can we create space for ourselves to calm our bodies, quiet our minds, and then to get on the work of school improvement? And when you do that, when you do calm your body down and quiet your mind, you realize there's a lot of things that we need to do if we are to help a rising generation to realize its full potential. The follow-up book to The Mindful Teacher for me is The New Imperatives of Educational Change, and my personal effort to try and understand that many systems, I would say my own, has been in a state of protracted crisis for many years, and to try and think beyond that situation of a crisis. So that's the scholarship that I'm drawing on. The structure for us right now has to do with this question of identity, which I think is an essential one. Who are we? Where are we going in our profession? What do we stand for? You have to stand for something, okay? Second of all, can we combine academic achievement with professional integrity? There's questions here. My jurisdiction, Massachusetts, does super well on PISA, on achievement. Way up there, right up there with Singapore, okay, on the PISA tests. But guess what? We're not very good at equity. So how do we create a system that isn't just high achieving in the aggregate, but is equitable for all of the students? How do we do that? Well, we've been working with a set of imperatives that I will argue are antiquated, that we need to get beyond, and we need a new set of orientation points in educational change. And I know that I have a lot of people in the room who want practical help with your challenges, and I will try and provide that to you and indicate something about the journey ahead for all of us. I'm afraid it will be a little bit fast. I hope that the translators are able to keep up. It's just one of those things when you're trying to share some big ideas. So this, for me, is our challenge. And by the way, Bildung, I couldn't understand, why when people talk about Bildung in the German language context, does it almost sound religious? What's going on that it sounds religious? Now, a friend explained to me, Dennis, it has to do with Luther. I said, really? What? How does that work? And they said, when he translated the Bible from Latin to German, he wrote that the human being was made im Bild Gottes. The human being was made in the image of God, Bild. This then is very interesting if you think that human beings should endeavor to model themselves, okay, towards the divine or the transcendent, however you might conceptualize that. In other words, this means that there's a spark in every one of us that shouldn't just be instrumentalized, just turned into an instrument for something else, but it is its own purpose. The human being is his or her own purpose. And how do we help our students and our children to understand that? I think it's good, actually, that there's a little bit of a religious dimension there because it gives a sense that there's some ultimate concern. Now, if we're going to support our students well, we have to support our teachers, right? This was a good point that was hit on earlier. You're not going to have thriving students achieving very well with burned out, angry, demoralized teachers. How do we do that? This means that for school leaders, whatever improvement you do, you have to think about what is the impact of this going to be on my teachers. So two things you think about, the change you want to make, and then the unintended consequences that the change may bring with it. This then leads us into the question of what achievement is. What are we actually all about? So in the international discourse, we've had a lot of focus for the past 17 years on the PISA results. And a lot of focus on getting those achievement results up from one jurisdiction to the next. But you could also think about worthy goals that you might want to have for your school or your system. So I've been working with one school in Canada where the students were doing a lot on current events. And they were very upset by the conflict in Syria. And they set about having a fundraising drive. And in their community, they have raised enough money to bring a refugee family into their community, and the children will attend their schools. You could think about that as a form of achievement also. And then you can also think about achievement as a result of your school system. Okay, so we had a big crisis in the US. The Atlanta school system was getting these great rises in their test scores, and it was exciting, and the superintendent won awards, and it was magnificent until we found out that there was rampant cheating throughout the system. Now we have over 130 educators in jail. In jail, okay? So one of the things you have to think about is if you're going to have a laser-like focus on academic achievement on tests, you might be building some corruption into the system itself. And I think we go a little bit too far if we blame the individuals. We have to look at the whole system that is producing those effects. So those are some thoughts on achievement. Now, because I'm always having crises in education, it's just one of the things I like to do. Anybody else like to have crises every few years in education? You wonder if you're actually doing the right thing, if you're really helping the kids who need the most help. I've been struggling with this issue of professional integrity for a while. So I was up at the Kleine Kielstraße Schule in Dortmund maybe 10 years ago. Do we have a colleague here from there? Okay, well, at any rate, that principle, I think for me, manifested integrity. This was one of the first winners of the Deutsche Schulpreis. She manifested personal integrity by going out on the street, and there was this one busy intersection, and she took me there, where there were drug dealers every afternoon, and where there were prostitutes. And she went out, and this was personal integrity, and she spoke to them, and she said, look, you're part of our community. I don't want to call the police. I don't want to get you in any trouble, but would you please not do this while the children are coming home from school? Okay, think about that. Think about going out of your comfort zone and engaging people in the community and not just turning them over to the authorities because they'll just come back or move several streets over or do something else, right? But you actually engage them in dialogue. That was another big word that came up, dialogue with the community, and said, could you help to make this a good environment for children? So that's integrity for me as a personal characteristic. Now, integrity as a professional disposition might be, that's good, but that's the one individual principal doing that. Can you get the whole faculty involved in things like, for example, going out and meeting parents in the community, going door to door, knocking on parents' home, and asking for their impressions of the school? I've done this with many other educators in Houston, Texas, my hometown for 10 years, having a rough time right now, but a lot of very visionary, hardworking educators. And you might say, well, how can we do that and not burn out the educators? You have to work with their professional associations. Professional associations understand that we need to reach the children where they are. So that's really transforming the profession to make it more community-oriented. And then I think that you can think of integrity as a result of an entire school system working together. And there's a number of reference societies. My favorite one, and the one that I know the best, is Canada, which works extremely hard on achievement and extremely hard on equity at the same time. So what does this mean? And now you can think of your own school of environment. How can you optimize the relationship between achievement and integrity? So let's imagine that you put together a quadrant, and then you thought of schools where there's low achievement and low integrity. So new public management was brought up a little bit earlier. So that's a philosophy basically where you do a lot of testing, a lot of accountability, and a lot of market-based reforms to put pressure on educators to get the results up. The problem is you might get rid of the principal, you might get rid of half of the teachers, and you bring them back in year after year after year, but then you're producing enormous churn in the system. So in the US and in England, we've actually been trying these kinds of reforms for many years now, and we're not finding evidence that it's improving things. It's simply demoralizing educators. So there you have low achievement and low integrity, but you can also get forms of high achievement with low integrity. And one of the ways that we found out one of our schools in Boston was doing this was that the children were taking tests every year that were measuring their academic achievement, and then the system switched to a computer-based system. And the test scores plummeted, right? And then, well, I'm not gonna point any fingers, I'm not gonna say anything mean, but one of the pressure points you can put in a system is when people are feeling under incredible duress, they'll go in and change the children's answers. Okay, so you got nominally high achievement, but with no integrity in the system. Then you can also get very low achievement with high integrity. I worked with a school in the US South where they had many principals. They were turning over every few years, and eventually they didn't know what else to do, so they got the minister of a local church, who was also a certified teacher, to come in and be the principal. And this guy loved everybody. I nicknamed him Dr. Love. He loved the children, he loved the teachers, he loved the community, he loved going into classrooms, he loved everything, but he had a very weak professional knowledge base, right? So within 2 years, he was out of there, right? So certainly integrity in terms of its positive intentions, but very low achievement. Then how do you kind of get to this magic quadrant of high achievement and high integrity? Well, I don't know if there are colleagues here from the Robert Bosch Gesamtschule. I write about that school in my new book. What you do is you get the faculty together and say, you know, we're in a bit of a crisis. We're struggling here. Let's start going into each other's classrooms and giving each other rigorous feedback and develop a team model. Okay? Or you could be like one of my former students, Andy Bott in Boston, who was sent to a school that was known as a principal killer. Orchard Gardens, kindergarten through 8th grade school. I think there were 6 principals in 8 years. And they had security guards in the school, and it was a tough place, and the children were afraid, and the faculty were afraid. And Andy went in and he looked at the situation, and he said, where's the arts curriculum in this school? And they had cut that to the bone because they wanted to get their test score results up. So what Andy did is he fired all of the security guards, and he did a nationwide search for the very best visual and performing arts teachers in the country. And he got them into this school, and if a student was misbehaving, he'd give them a saxophone, or he'd give them a violin, or he'd give them a paintbrush. And before you know it, those kids were achieving, and the results were shooting up. That's achievement with integrity, ladies and gentlemen. We can do that kind of thing in all of our schools with enough courage and with enough support. We need support. That's why conferences like this are so important. But how do things happen like that? This system that I'm describing that's kind of been spinning out of control, and unfortunately, I think in our context in the US, it will continue struggling now for many years to come. Well, I think that there's a set of old imperatives that have misguided us. And the first one is an ideological one, the belief that markets and accountability and testing are the magic formula for getting results up. Okay, so there's an old ideological imperative, and it's been almost religious in reform circles, not just in the US, not just in England, but actually internationally, because this set of beliefs has been pushed out, especially by Washington, but also by other jurisdictions, onto much of the global South through an imperial imperative. And this has really been about telling teachers what to do. It's really simple. Just tell them what to do and make sure that they do it. Sounds simple. The problem is you left out their brains. Sorry. Okay. I'm getting a little worked up. Is that okay? Okay. So you left out the thinking, feeling, judging human being who can modify instruction, who can go back and rework lesson plans with a prescriptive imperative. And these things often become very, very insular. So the country's just looking within itself, the district is looking within itself, the school system is looking within itself, and then education becomes instrumentalized. It's not for the holistic development of the student. Rather, it is for narrow instrumental purposes of getting an economy up and humming. Now, how do we get beyond this thing? So this is Dennis Shirley. These are my thoughts. You can think your own thoughts. When I come to conferences like this, I don't expect every idea to be the greatest idea I ever heard, but just gather a few that you can go back and work with. So how do we move from ideology to evidence and getting good at looking at all kinds of evidence, not just test score results? How do we move from pushing out ideas onto a whole world to a hermeneutic of practice? And how do we think about who's in our interpretive communities? Can we move from prescription to professionalism? And really developing this theme that was very nice of Bildung 5.0, of developing the whole profession for many years to come, doing that in a way in which we're conscious of our responsibilities, not just as local citizens, but as citizens of the world. And finally, and this is one I personally care about the most, the existential imperative to help our students to find meaning and purpose in their lives. Meaning and purpose in their lives. If you know what your life's about, your meaning and purpose, you can take a lot of abuse. You can get knocked down and get back up again. But if you're not sure what that is, then everything's a lot harder. So we have these old imperatives that have led us a lot towards testing for fidelity. And then we have a set of new imperatives that my hope is, my wager is, my prayer is, could lead us towards achievement with integrity. And this is kind of the core argument in the new book. I know it's a little bit simplistic. I know you could kind of criticize it from different perspectives. That's okay. We present our different ideas to get them out there and to have collegial conversations with another. So how can we get practical about this? Well, first we got to get better at studying all of the evidence that's out there about our students. And so back in 2012, the PISA results came out showing that Shanghai was the highest achieving jurisdiction in the world on math, science, and reading. And everybody went crazy, and all of a sudden there were study trips going off to Shanghai at the speed of light, and institutes like the Grattan Institute in Australia were writing about how we should all try and emulate Shanghai's system. And then you got people like Mark Tucker in the United States writing books about surpassing Shanghai. And you got Charlene Tan from Singapore writing about learning from Shanghai. And before you knew it, everybody was charging off to learn from Shanghai because they had one data point that they were all excited about. They were looking at some of the evidence. Then, in March of this year, and this is a report that's available for free from the OECD, but you have to be patient and spend a lot of time looking through these reports. The OECD came out with a new study on student well-being. Student well-being. Darn it, how did we forget about that for all those years? So somebody was kind of finally saying, gee, I wonder how the kids are doing. Why don't we ask them? It was really interesting. If you kind of go back and you're looking at everything up until this report, it was really a peripheral concern for a lot of educational change efforts. And then this guide came out. I'm not sure how well you can see it. Let me focus in on the essential stuff. But it basically shows well-being is over there on the left, and academic achievement is on the left, and life satisfaction is on the right. And the key thing to look at here is where's Shanghai here? Above average science performance, below average life satisfaction. And what you actually find is that many of the jurisdictions that do the best on the international tests have students that are not very happy with their lives. They have low well-being. Now, does this mean that there's not an argument to be made for pushing kids really hard, and maybe they just have to suffer a bit, maybe they have to struggle, maybe that's part of life? Well, you could put forward that argument. Be interesting to entertain. But we should at least have a conversation about the evidence. Okay, so when we go forward with educational change, can we get better at studying all of the evidence that we have about our students. And the favorite thing I'm seeing now in early childhood classrooms is teachers with iPads, and they're taking pictures and films of the learning of their students. And then they go back and they look at what they're seeing in the films. And if the students say, "Why are you filming me?" They say, "Because I want to get better at teaching you. I want to learn more about your learning." And then the kids are, "Cool, all right." And you're developing trust with your students. And then you can show those films also to the parents. So we're really having an opportunity now with new technologies to open up our evidentiary base. Now let's get practical about interpretation. One of the things we were doing for years, unfortunately, is we were throwing mountains of data at teachers. Here's your students' data, get your achievement results up. Very weak support in terms of their professional communities. Now, I understand that in Switzerland and Germany now, I think mostly when those test data are gathered, it's for diagnostic purposes. It's not printed in the newspapers. Okay, good. We kind of need you guys right now in Northern Europe for a while. Would you kind of maybe pick up your game, be a little bit more visible? Because you're doing really good things. And actually, this imperative that I have in the book is actually about Germany. Germany was improving its PISA results for many years, and I know that people in Germany are often critical of the educational system, but I think that there's some good things that everybody can learn from Germany. The Akademie des Deutschen Schulpreises, I described the Academy of the German School Prize, and also the project 1 Square Kilometer of Education that works with inner city populations. So this is also from Canada. One of the things that they're doing now is when the teachers take these films of their student learning, they don't privatize it, they actually study in communities their students' learning. So as recently as 5 or 6 years ago, they would identify students who were struggling on the basis of their test score results. And then they would go really deep, and they would hammer away on those students just to get them above the cut score that would get the results up. But now, actually, what they're doing is they want to build on students' strengths. So they're also looking at what the students can do. And if the students have a different language than English or French, depending on the system that they are, they view that as an asset. And if the student forms friends quickly, they view that as an asset. If the student is generous. So they're gathering lots of different information. They used to call these students that the teachers would choose marker students. Then they changed them into students of mystery. And today they refer to them as students of wonder. So you take a picture of your student, you put them right in the middle of the table with your colleagues, and then you all try and figure out what can be done to help this student to thrive in your environment. So interpret intentionally and think about who you're bringing on board to help you with your interpretations. In a Francophone board in Canada, they might bring in a cultural consultant on such a team. They might bring in somebody who's working with safe and inclusive schools to make sure that gay and lesbian students aren't being bullied by their peers. There's lots of different things that you can think about when you put together your interpretive community. Now, if I could just say this, this is one of the reasons we have to be very alert now when we think about the speed of educational change. So Liberia in sub-Saharan Africa has basically privatized the whole of their public education system to a group called Bridge International Academies. And this is a report that I found online of Bridge International Academies. It basically says, through standardization and automation, Bridge has streamlined their operations and largely removed teachers and administrators from the education process altogether. Altogether. Now, how do you do that? Basically, you have some lesson plans that you've developed in Cambridge, Massachusetts. You push those out into the schools, okay? And they could be in Africa, they could be in India, they could be in Latin America, they could be in the US. And then the teacher reads from the lesson plans, and the students respond. And then folks back in Cambridge can see what's going on with the lessons and can provide feedback back to the teachers. Now, on the one hand, that could be a magnificent system, but please notice here the threat that this could form to this whole idea that was brought up earlier, that human relationships are essential in the educational process, that pedagogical judgment is essential. And you might say, well, what does this have to do with me? I'm in Switzerland, I'm in Germany, I don't have to deal with these things. Anybody remember this? Apple IIe. For the dinosaurs in the room, I'm one of them. I started writing my doctoral dissertation at Harvard on this back in 1985. Okay, actually, no, I started working on an IBM PC, and then I switched over to this. This was originally designed for children, but the adults found that it worked better for them, so they switched over. So one of the things that's coming up for us, ladies and gentlemen, if we like it or not, is massive disruption to our sector. Massive disruption. Okay, and you can already kind of see it in how Bridge International Academies is spreading, and expect much more to be coming in. Actually, in that OECD report on schools of the future, it referred to deprofessionalization and privatization of the educational system. Maybe there's opportunities in there, but we certainly should be vigilant about what's coming our way. If you really want to be frightened about the future, I recommend this book to you, The Rise of the Robots, Technology and the Threat of a Jobless Future. Because if I could, there was one comment earlier that said, we are preparing students for an economy, and 1/3 of them will go to jobs that we don't even know what they will be. But it might be that 1/3 of them don't have jobs. This book actually provides, I think one of the things that shook me up is there was a sports story, and it was a great sports story, and then it asked you to rate it. It was about a baseball game, and it turned out the sports story had been written by a computer program. And they've already had a symphony performed in London that was written by a computer program. So one of the things to be aware of is with digitization, it is accelerating very, very quickly, as is the ability of computers to learn from one another and to respond to different pressures that they might be measuring in their system. So Andy Hargreaves and I did this book. It has a chapter which refers to 5 different types of professional capital. And I'd ask you all just to think about these for your buildings and where they are right now. And the first one is human capital. How do we help our individual colleagues to get as smart as they possibly can in the field? Get the best professional knowledge that they can as individuals. And then, can we get really good at spreading it around? And I don't just mean what sociologists refer to as bonding social capital, where you're talking with people like you, other Shul leaders, for example, but bridging social capital when you're talking to people who are quite different from you, maybe in your community, or maybe in your school. And then this is the essential one for me, the decisional capital. You know when you're teaching and you taught a first period class and it went brilliantly and you did the exact same lesson and you're teaching it to your second period class and it's totally bombing? You want to kind of get the students totally engaged, and what works so well at 8 o'clock is disastrous at 9 o'clock. Good teachers have the judgment to modify their lessons. And that's part of the art of our craft that helps us to be very good at educating all students. We develop our moral capital because we're committed to equity and inclusion. And then finally, symbolic capital. How do we project to the public at large that we are part of a glorious profession, which is helping to prepare a rising generation for the challenges of the years to come? How do we do that? I love actually one thing about Singapore. When you get email messages from colleagues in Singapore, they always write, "Yours in the service of education." They don't say, "I am a grade 4 teacher in this school." They don't say, "I'm a principal in this school." They don't say, I'm a professor at this university." They have "yours in the service of education." And they bring something of a religious fervor to that calling. So, we can get practical by looking at evidence, all of the evidence. We can get practical by thinking about our interpretive communities. We can get practical by strengthening our profession. We can also get practical by thinking globally. It's just not practical to pretend that climate change doesn't exist. It's just not practical to pretend that demographic change is going to stop. I am so glad, please forgive me for saying this, it's a personal note, but my grandmother was an orphan when she came to the United States. There's actually a beautiful expression. It's called "beauty is in the eye of the beholder." And it was written by my great-grandmother, Margaret Wolfe Hungerford. But she died in Ireland. Then her husband moved to Canada. He couldn't handle the Canadian winters. He got a train to San Francisco. He died of pneumonia in Nevada and is buried in a pauper's grave. This left 5 kids up in Canada. An American came up, visited, saw the situation, made sure that the kids were taken care of, and brought my grandmother back down to the US. There was nobody at that time saying, "We're going to kick you out because your parents have died." There was nobody there to come around and arrest the children, as has been happening. So we have to dare to be global. And this wonderful expression from the cellist Pablo Casals, love of your country is a beautiful thing, but why does the love have to stop at the border? How do we do that? Well, one of the ways for myself is to not forget the Sustainable Development Goals. And thanks to Education International and our colleagues in the International Teachers Unions Associations, quality education is up there. We have it within our grasp by 2030 to eliminate extreme poverty. We can get rid of hunger. We can promote health care and high-quality primary and secondary education for all children. We need big, hairy, audacious goals, BHAG goals. We do not need SMART goals. Do these things come over here? SMART goals, specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and time-bound. What you get with SMART goals is you get people saying, we're going to raise our test score results from 73% this year to 85% next year. You get tiny, tiny little incremental goals because nobody wants to fail at hitting their goals. But Martin Luther King did not stand up before thousands of people and say, I have SMART goals. I have SMART goals today. You could see them as smarty pants goals. I want to say the other thing I was going to say. It's not polite. Okay, so we have to have these big goals, these big visions, and think globally because it is so beautiful. I get it that it's practical. I get it that it's trade, but let's not be like the folks in one small town in a jurisdiction I'm not going to mention, but you can imagine where they're really not so sure about all this global citizenship stuff. But when their local economy tanks, then all of a sudden they figure out that there's a big market for alfalfa in China. That's just having an instrumental relationship. Why can't we kind of go deeper, go into the poetry of a language, go into the cadence and the beauty of it? I still don't speak Swiss dialect very well, but I love to listen to it. It's like if you're an English speaker and you go to the west of Ireland, there's this amazing cadence. The people are speaking beautiful music, and they do it all day long, every day. Why wouldn't we want our children to know how to enjoy that? And why wouldn't we want our children to have lives that are filled with meaning and purpose? And this is a tricky one because we can't just tell them what their meaning and purpose is. We have to help them to find that. How can you help them to find that? Well, maybe through literature, maybe through poetry, maybe even help them to do something old-fashioned like to memorize some beautiful poetry that will get them through life's toughest times, the hardest times, the times when you're experiencing the dark night of the soul, which we all do. Thank you. That's La Noche Oscura del Alma from St. John of the Cross. And if you're living in these times, and especially if you're coming from my context, you need meaning and purpose. But we're not the first ones to need meaning and purpose. Everybody could need it. So I understand I have some Italian colleagues here in the front row. So Primo Levi, beautiful, beautiful, beautiful writer, okay, writing about his experiences in Auschwitz. Se questo è un uomo, if this be a man. And there's one point where he's going to get some food with an Alsatian inmate, Jean, and Jean wants to learn some Italian, and Primo Levi is trying to remember some lines from Dante Alighieri. And he's trying to remember it, and it's key because at this point he's losing his Italian because most of the Italian inmates have died. And he struggles, and he struggles, and he struggles, and finally he remembers the words, considerate la vostra semenza, fati non foste a vivere come brute, ma perseguir virtute e conoscenza. In English, that's, consider from what noble seed you spring. You are created not to live like beasts, but for pursuit of virtue and knowledge. And he says, for a moment, I forgot where I was and what had been done to me. It was like a trumpet call. It was like the voice of God. And you might think, well, okay, that's just a story. I had the great fortune to be a visiting professor in Venice last fall, and I was walking in a graveyard, and in the graveyard, an Italian had died in recent years, and it put this quote on the graveyard. So we can help our young people to find meaning and purpose, and we can give them poetry that helps them through the dark times of life. As educators, we can study all the evidence, we can interpret it, we can strengthen our profession, we can dare to be global in insular times, and we can help our students to find meaning and purpose. And we can do this together, and it can be fun, and it can be enjoyable. How do we do it? Rediscover the grandeur of our calling. Okay, don't squander it. Don't get lost in all the details. Nourish our collective responsibility for a rising generation. We can do these things to engender teaching that sparkles with creativity. You know, when you're in a classroom and it's so much fun, and the students are calling out to the teacher things like, "You're our second mother." I saw this in a music class in Idaho. Okay, they just loved that class. Okay, we can do these things. We can traverse the whole terrain of school improvement, and we will do this at this conference. We will uplift each other. We will hone and polish our professionalism, and we will learn from the best practices wherever they are. Maybe it's lesson study in Asia. Maybe it's pedagogy of Paulo Freire in Latin America. Maybe it's indigenous practices from around the world that actually say we don't just have to worry about getting people digitized all the time, that we actually should get them out into nature and hike these magnificent mountains and go up and experience the thrill of getting through a rainstorm in the forest, getting soaking wet. I went hiking with Andy Hargraves in England. We came to a bed and breakfast. The woman opens the door and says, "Come in, wet rats." We were soaked to the bone. Don't we want our children to have those experiences? It's magnificent. Ladies and gentlemen, this is our opportunity. A fragile and precarious world needs us. I'd like to thank you so much for the honor of speaking with you this afternoon, and I wish you all a magnificent conference.